The wind that swept across northern Wisconsin in the 1,920 seconds carried the taste of iron and the smell of hay, dragging dust across the flat land until it vanished against a line of birch trees. Poplar was barely a town, 500 souls at most, a single main road, a grain elevator, and miles of open fields where sound traveled farther than ambition. It was there, in a farmhouse built from rough pine, that Richard Ira Bong came into the world on the 24th of September 1920. He was the first of 9 children born to Carl and Dora Bong, Swedish immigrants who believed in work more than words, in prayer more than pride. They raised their children the way they worked their soil, honestly, stubbornly, without complaint. From the beginning, Richard, everyone called him Dick, moved differently. While other boys chased chickens and skipped rocks, he dragged scrap metal behind the barn, building contraptions from whatever he could salvage. He tore apart engines, the way other kids tore pages from school books, and somehow he always managed to put them back together again. His father used to laugh that the boy had grease in his veins instead of blood. Dick would grin, wipe his hands on his overalls, and go back to work. On the farm, everything was mechanical. The pulleys that hauled hay, the pump that drew water, the tractor that refused to start in winter. Machines didn't scare him, they spoke to him in a language of vibration and heat. School offered no such clarity. Numbers slid past him, words tangled, but anything that moved, any system of gears or wheels, made sense. His teachers wrote that he lacked patience for theory, but possessed remarkable practical intelligence. He wasn't a prodigy, but he was relentless. When something broke, he fixed it. When something worked, he tried to make it better. The depression came like frost and stayed like hunger, but on the Bong farm, there was always motion. Milking at dawn, hauling blades through the hay, feeding cows by belief alone. Discipline became instinct. One summer afternoon, a mail plane buzzed low over Poplar, scattering chickens and children alike. Dick dropped his pitchfork and stared at the sky until the dot vanished into sunlight. He didn't yet know the word for what he felt, only that gravity suddenly seemed negotiable. From that moment on, he looked up as much as he looked ahead. In 1938, at 18, he left the farm to attend Superior State Teachers College on the edge of Lake Superior, planning to become a physical education instructor. It was a sensible path for a farm boy with strong arms and modest ambitions. The country was crawling out of the Depression. People wanted security, not miracles. His parents were proud their eldest child would teach instead of till. But history, restless as weather, was shifting. That same year, the federal government created the civilian pilot training program, quietly preparing for the war that everyone feared, but few admitted was coming. The posters promised adventure in exchange for discipline. When Bong saw one pinned to the college bulletin board, a bright airplane slicing through clouds, he signed his name out of curiosity. He had never been inside a plane. He had only watched them carve the sky. The first time the wheels left the ground, something ancient inside him lifted too. The world shrank to a grid of fields, barns, and glinting rivers. Wind filled the cockpit like a voice. He was no longer Richard Bong, farmer's son. He was a creature of air and instinct. His instructor, a World War I veteran named Captain Decker, said later, he didn't learn to fly, he remembered. Within weeks, Bong was rolling and diving with a confidence that startled the older men. He flew as if the machine were an extension of his pulse. By 1941, he had earned his civilian pilot's license. The summer was hot, the fields golden, the world deceptively calm. He wrote home that he might teach after all, maybe buy a small plane someday. But that December, the radio in the college cafeteria crackled with a voice that changed everything. Japanese planes have attacked Pearl Harbor. The words cut through the static like shrapnel. Students froze. Professors turned pale. By nightfall, the United States was at war. The next morning, Bong stood in line at a recruiting office, boots muddy from melting snow. 4 days after the attack, he enlisted in the Army Air Forces. His mother wept into her apron. His father placed a hand on his shoulder and said nothing. Fathers rarely do when pride and fear share the same breath. Training began in California, where the sun burned and rules multiplied. The Air Forces shaped men through repetition. Roll, dive, climb, shoot, survive. Most recruits broke before they bent. Bong did neither. He was quiet, polite, infuriatingly calm. Instructors noted his steady hands, his refusal to panic, his almost mechanical precision. But they also noticed something else, a streak of recklessness that surfaced only in the air. One afternoon in 1942, he took his new P-38 Lightning over San Francisco Bay. The twin-engine fighter was unlike anything he had ever flown: fast, heavy, built for killing. Instead of practicing over open fields as ordered, he banked toward the city. Witnesses later said a silver blur screamed between rooftops, close enough for people to see the pilot's grin. A week later, he flew under the Golden Gate Bridge, his propellers cutting the fog like knives. The stunt nearly ended his career before it began. Summoned before General George C. Kenney, Bong expected to be grounded permanently. Kenney studied the young pilot for a long moment, then said, "Either you're insane or you're brilliant. I haven't decided which." Instead of a court-martial, Bong received a punishment disguised as opportunity. He was ordered to teach aerobatics to new cadets. It was the best sentence he could have been given. Teaching forced him to dissect flight until it became philosophy. He learned the thresholds of torque and stall, the fine balance between thrust and gravity. He treated each maneuver like scripture. Every roll had meaning, every dive consequence. By the time his suspension ended, he knew the P-38 better than its designers. The plane suited him perfectly. Twin engines humming in harmony, 4 50-caliber guns, and a 20mm cannon centered in its nose, all power focused straight ahead. It could climb faster than any Zero, dive steeper than any Spitfire, and in the hands of the right pilot, kill before the enemy knew he was there. Most men feared its complexity. Bong loved it for the same reason he once loved a stubborn tractor: the challenge of control. While he trained, the world burned. The Japanese swept through the Pacific like fire, through dry grass, Hong Kong, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies. In 1942, the United States pushed back, inch by inch, island by island. The war needed pilots who could not only fight but think. Bong, now 21, shipped out with the 9th Fighter Squadron of the 49th Group, bound for the fetid jungles of New Guinea. The airfield at Port Moresby was nothing more than dirt carved from jungle, fringed with tents and mosquitoes. The heat clung like wet cloth. Engines overheated, men collapsed, and malaria claimed more lives than bullets. At night, Japanese bombers droned overhead, dropping death by routine. Bong wrote home, "The days melt and the nights bite. I'd give anything for a breath of Wisconsin wind." He spent those first weeks learning the terrain, the mountains that rose like teeth, the storms that built and broke within minutes. His P-38, painted dull silver, bore no marks yet. That changed on the 27th of December, 1942. His unit lifted off before dawn, assigned to patrol the skies over Buna, a coastal village where Allied forces were clawing their way inland. Bong flew wingman in a loose formation of 4. The sea below flashed gold, the horizon burned with clouds. Then the warning crackled over radio. Enemy bombers, escorted by Zeros, inbound. They appeared out of the sun, 20 dark specks, expanding into death, while the others formed up, Bong Dove. Training manuals said never to dive straight through a formation. He did exactly that. The twin engines screamed as he cut between enemy planes, positioning himself behind a Zero. He fired a 2-second burst. Tracers stitched the sky, and the Japanese fighter exploded in a ball of flame. Without pausing, he rolled, spotted another Zero climbing, and fired again, a second bloom of fire. It was over in less than a minute. When he returned to base, his plane was spotless, not a single bullet hole. The mechanics stared. Luck, they said, but Bong knew better. It was geometry, patience, precision, the same principles he'd learned fixing farm equipment in Poplar. That night, sitting on an ammunition crate, he cleaned his guns with a rag that smelled of oil and cordite. Someone slapped him on the back and called him a hero. He only shrugged. Just did my job. The war would make that sentence both prophecy and curse. Outside his tent, the jungle hummed. The same moon that hung over Wisconsin glowed above New Guinea, pale and distant. Bong looked up, wondering how far a man could go before he stopped being the boy who once chased an airplane across a field. He didn't know it yet, but the number of enemy planes he would bring down, 40 confirmed kills, would make him the greatest American ace of all time. He didn't know the medals, the fame, or the tragedy that waited beyond the horizon. All he knew was the next mission, the next dawn, the next moment when the earth would once again fall away beneath him, and the world would make sense. For now, he was still the farm boy from Poplar, quiet, precise, and fearless in a way that comes only from those who have known hard labor and honest land. The sky had given him purpose, but the farm had given him strength. The dust of Wisconsin still clung to his boots as he climbed into the cockpit, unaware that history had already written his name in the clouds. The war moved fast. The Pacific burned like a fuse stretching across half the world, and in the smoke and confusion of that first brutal year, Richard Ira Bong was learning how to kill without losing his soul. He arrived in New Guinea young enough to still believe in luck, but the tropics taught him something colder. Survival was a craft. The airfield at Port Moresby was a scar carved into jungle. Heat rippled off the corrugated runways. The ground crews worked shirtless, their skin the color of rust and oil. The air stank of gasoline, quinine, and death. Bong slept in a tent where the canvas never stopped sweating. Every night the Japanese bombers came, black dots against the moon, engines droning like the pulse of a mechanical god. He'd wake to the rattle of anti-aircraft fire and the ground trembling under his cot. When daylight came, he climbed into his P-38 Lightning, the twin-engine fighter that looked more like a weapon than an airplane, 2 booms, 1 cockpit, a machine built for decisive men. The brass called it the fork-tailed devil. To Bong, it was something alive. He could feel when one engine ran hotter, when a gust twisted the fuselage. He could sense the plane's mood the way a farmer senses rain. Combat turned men into legends or corpses, often both. Bong's first months blurred into smoke and adrenaline. The Japanese dominated the skies with their Mitsubishi Zeros, lighter, faster, almost acrobatic. But the Zeros were fragile. A single burst from the Lightning's 4. 50 caliber guns could tear them apart. Bong studied them like prey, how they climbed, how they panicked. He kept notes in a small green book. Altitude, angle, distance. Killing was mathematics measured in seconds. He called his rule close. Fire, get away. No chivalry, no showmanship, just precision. You don't win a dogfight by dancing, he told a rookie. You win by cutting the other man's wings off before he knows you're there. By spring of 1943, Bong had racked up 5 confirmed kills, making him an ace. He wrote home only that he was doing his part. The papers back in Wisconsin printed his name in small headlines, but Bong shrugged it off. Fame didn't feed you in the sky. What fed him was discipline, hauling the Lightning through tropical storms, dragging dust off runways that melted under the sun, learning how to breathe while men around him died. His commanders saw it too. General George Kenney, now head of the Allied Air Forces in the Southwest Pacific, called him crazy enough to be brilliant. The label stuck. They began calling him the Madman of the sky, not because he was reckless, but because he seemed untouchable. That summer, the missions multiplied. April 1943 brought the largest air battles yet over the Huon Gulf. 50 American P-38 seconds against nearly the same number of Japanese fighters. The sky became a boiling cauldron of smoke, sunlight, and tracer fire. Bong moved through it like a surgeon. He peeled away from formation, dove through a cluster of Zeros, and in 2 passes shot down 3 planes. One of his comrades later swore he saw Bong's aircraft skim so close to an explosion that its wings vanished in the fireball before re-emerging untouched. When they landed, Bong's plane was spotless again. No holes, no dents, just heat haze rising from the engines. Pilots whispered that he carried luck in his blood. Bong said nothing. He only logged the date, the time, the ammunition spent. But war was hungry, and luck had limits. In June 1943, during a low-level ground attack, his Lightning was ripped apart by anti-aircraft fire. One engine exploded, shrapnel tore through the wing. He flew 120 miles on a single motor over jungle and sea, jettisoning everything: ammo, radio, even the emergency kit to lighten the load. The aircraft limped home, smoke trailing like a banner. When he landed, the mechanics counted 40 bullet holes. He climbed out shaking, the smell of burning oil in his lungs. Later that night, alone in his tent, he realized that skill wasn't enough. Death had brushed past him, close enough to leave a fingerprint. From that moment, he fought differently. No wild maneuvers, no unnecessary risks. Efficiency replaced audacity. He attacked with surgical precision, striking from altitude, diving hard, vanishing before the enemy could react. The method worked. In July alone, he scored 15 kills. The brass couldn't ignore it. He was promoted to captain, awarded the Silver Star, and his face began to appear on morale posters across the Pacific. Still, he wrote home about weather, about mosquitoes, about missing his mother's cooking, never about the men he killed. In letters preserved today, his tone is steady, almost apologetic. "Every time I shoot one down," he wrote, "I think there's a man in there with a family somewhere. I don't feel like cheering." By late 1943, Bong had 21 confirmed victories, making him the highest-scoring American ace at the time. Yet he remained in the same tent, the same dirt, the same routine: dawn patrol, debrief, maintenance, write a letter, try to sleep through the shelling. Fame couldn't shield him from malaria or grief. He lost friends faster than he gained medals. Each death carved another quiet space inside him. The myth of the Madman began to grow. Newspapers back home called him the guardian angel of the Pacific. Pilots who flew with him said he had a sixth sense for danger. He'd appear out of nowhere, guns blazing, to save a squad mate pinned under enemy fire. Once, after a chaotic engagement over Leh, he escorted 2 damaged Lightnings all the way back to base, engines sputtering, refusing to leave them behind, even as his own fuel gauge hit empty. He became a leader, not by rank, but by gravity. Men trusted him. They called him Bongster with affection, like a brother who never missed a shot. When he walked the flight line, mechanics stopped talking. He treated everyone, the cook, the general, the new kid, with the same quiet respect. But the more victories he earned, the heavier they felt. Sleep became harder. The air itself seemed to hum with ghosts. One night, as thunder rolled over the jungle, he told another pilot, "We all have our number. Maybe mine's just not up yet." War has a way of testing prophecy. In October 1943, over Rabaul, the most fortified Japanese base in the South Pacific, Bong met his match. The dogfight began at 20,000 feet and ended nearly at sea level. A single Zero pilot, moving with uncanny precision, mirrored every move Bong made. They looped and dove through clouds, 2 predators locked in a deadly dance. Bong's ammunition ran low, his engines screamed in protest. He broke one of his own rules. He baited the enemy, pretending to stall. The Zero lunged. Bong inverted, fired a 2-second burst. The Japanese plane erupted mid-air. But Bong's Lightning was riddled with holes. Hydraulic fluid poured like blood. He flew it home on instinct alone, landing on one engine, brakes gone, stopping inches from the jungle edge. When the mechanics inspected the wreck, they found a bullet hole through the canopy, an inch from his skull. Bong looked at it once, said nothing, and walked away. That night, he couldn't sleep. Victory had never felt so fragile. General Kenny called him to headquarters. Instead of reprimand, the general poured him a drink. "You've done more than your share," he said. "Try not to get yourself killed before we win this thing." Bong nodded, but the next morning he was back in the air. He couldn't stop. Flying was the only place he still understood the world. By December, command forced him to take leave. America needed heroes, and the quiet boy from Wisconsin had become one. When he stepped off the transport in San Francisco, photographers flashed bulbs in his face. Reporters asked what it felt like to be the greatest ace in U.S. history. Bong squinted against the light and said, "It just means I've been lucky longer than most." He didn't stay long in the spotlight. Crowds made him restless. The noise felt wrong after the steady hum of engines and gunfire. He visited aircraft factories, met factory workers, shook hands, smiled politely. In their eyes, he saw the version of himself he didn't recognize, invincible, clean, untouched by death. He carried none of that. Inside, he was already older than 23. Then, in Superior, Wisconsin, at a small community event, he met Marjorie Vattendahl, a librarian with kind eyes and a voice soft as paper. She wasn't impressed by medals. She saw the exhaustion beneath the smile. They talked for hours about books, snow, and silence. For the first time since the war began, Bong felt the ground again, steady, human. He began writing to her daily, letters full of restraint and longing. "It's strange," he confessed, "to feel alive after so much death." The army let him rest for a while, but history was still calling. Soon he would return to the Pacific for one final campaign, driven not by duty alone but by something rarer, the hope of coming home. The madman of the sky had learned the cost of survival. Now he would test whether love could anchor a man who belonged to the clouds. By the end of 1943, the war had eaten the Pacific alive. The maps changed, weakly red lines of Japanese control shrinking under waves of American steel and sweat. In that brutal arithmetic of victory, one man's name began to rise from the chaos. Richard Ira Bong, the quiet boy from Wisconsin, who had turned the sky into his classroom. He was 23. His hair had started to gray at the temples. His hands never shook, but the weight in his eyes told another story. Every kill made him a legend. Every letter home made him human. In December, he was sent north again, New Guinea, Dobadura, Nadzab, places that existed only in dispatches and nightmares. His P-38 Lightning, christened Marge after the woman waiting in Wisconsin, gleamed under the equatorial sun like a silver animal ready to strike. The ground crew painted her name in careful cursive on the nose cone. Bong smiled once briefly. "If I go down," he said, "I'll take her name higher than the clouds." He wasn't flying for medals anymore. He was flying to survive, to bring his men home, to keep Marjorie's letters from being the last good thing in the world. The Japanese were still fierce in the air, but by early 1944 the balance had shifted. The P-38 seconds ruled the skies over the Philippines and New Guinea. Bong's tactics, dive, fire, climb, disappear, had become doctrine across the 49th Fighter Group. Pilots studied his logbooks the way seminarians study scripture. He'd rewritten how to fight in the air. No fancy dogfights, no cinematic loops, just precision, discipline, speed. In January, he shot down his 26th enemy plane. In February, 3 more. By April, his total reached 27, enough to surpass Eddie Rickenbacker, the ace of World War I. The military called for a press event. Cameras rolled, flashbulbs popped. Bong stood awkwardly before them, his cap crooked, his boots dusty. "What's it like being the top ace?" a reporter asked. Bong shrugged. "It means I've been lucky. Others deserve it more." General Douglas MacArthur disagreed. The Supreme Commander summoned him to Australia to award the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration in the United States. In front of the cameras, MacArthur's voice boomed. "Major Bong, you are a credit to your race, your family, and your country." Bong saluted, expression steady. When pressed for a statement, he said only, "Thank you, sir." The general later wrote, "He had the humility of a farmer and the calm of a man who had seen too much. But glory was a strange kind of wound. The more the world celebrated him, the less he could feel it. Nights were long and heavy with dreams of fire. He'd wake sweating, tasting smoke. He wrote to Marjorie that sometimes he still saw the faces of Japanese pilots as their planes burned. "They're boys too," he wrote. Boys who could have fixed tractors in another life. He returned to the front anyway. Duty was simpler than peace. The brass wanted him grounded, too valuable to lose, but Bong insisted. He was promoted to major, then assigned as a combat instructor, yet he kept flying unofficial missions. Pilots joked that the only way to keep Bong grounded was to cut off the engines. Through summer 1944, the Allied advance tore across the Pacific like a storm. Bong's P-38, Marge, became a familiar silhouette against the clouds. He wasn't the loudest pilot or the fastest, but his precision was terrifying. Witnesses said he attacked like a hawk, silent until the last second, then all motion and fury. He'd appear out of nowhere, one pilot recalled, and in 10 seconds there'd be one less zero in the sky. The numbers kept climbing, 30, 33, 37 kills. But Bong didn't count anymore. He carried the tally like a stone in his chest. The squadron had started losing new pilots almost as fast as they arrived. Kids barely out of flight school, chasing his legend, dying before they understood the rules. Bong tried to teach them, patience kills faster than courage. Some listened, most didn't live long enough to. In September, his closest friend, Tom Lynch, went down over the Philippines. The wreckage burned for hours on the jungle floor. Bong spent the night sitting by his tent, staring at the stars, silent. In his notebook that day, he wrote only 2 words: still counting. By late 1944, the press called him the guardian angel of the Pacific. For soldiers on the ground, the name fit. When bombers flew into Japanese airspace, they looked for the silver twin tail glinting above them that was Bong, circling like a shepherd watching his flock. He didn't just chase kills anymore. He protected. That, perhaps, was his truest instinct. The 49th Fighter Group turned into a family under him. He'd walk the line before every mission, checking planes, shaking hands, cracking quiet jokes. Fly smart, he'd say. The sky's big enough for us all if you use your head. Men followed him not because of rank, but because he believed they deserved to live. On the 17th of December 1944, the Pacific sky lit up one last time for him. A flight of Japanese Ki-43 Oscars moved to intercept American bombers over the Philippines. Bong was flying escort in Marge. The sun burned low and red behind him. He saw an Oscar dive toward a B-24, its guns flashing. He dropped throttle, rolled once, fired a 3-second burst. The enemy plane exploded mid-air. His 40th kill, 40 victories, 40 deaths, 40 times. Fate had flipped a coin and let him live. No American pilot would ever pass that number, not before or since. After the mission, the base threw a celebration. Men cheered, poured beer into helmets, lifted him on their shoulders. Bong laughed once, awkwardly, then slipped away to his tent. He cleaned his flight gloves, folded his maps, and wrote a letter to Marjorie. "The war's almost over," he told her. "Maybe I can come home and be a teacher after all." But something had changed. He was 24, and already he felt older than his father. The jungle, the noise, the endless climbing into the unknown, it had burned the boy out of him. He'd become legend, but legends can't rest. Command knew it too. General Kenny summoned him again. "Major," he said, "you've done enough. I need you alive. You're coming home." Bong protested, but Kenny's order stood. The next morning, Marge sat silent on the tarmac, her engines cold. Bong walked one last slow circle around her, hand brushing the metal skin. "You and I," he whispered, "we did all right." He left the Pacific 3 days later. Soldiers lined the runway, saluting as his transport plane rose into the dawn. Behind him, the war still thundered on. When he landed in California in early 1945, the world was waiting. Cameras, parades, speeches. America needed heroes, and he was the purest they had, humble, undefeated, clean. He smiled for photos, shook hands, signed autographs. But when the flashes stopped, the silence hit hard. Civilians called it peace, Bong called it confusion. He married Marjorie in February 1945 in a small church in Superior, Wisconsin. No band, no press, just family and friends. Snow fell outside while they said their vows. Someone joked that the ace who'd defied death 40 times looked more nervous holding his wife's hand than flying through gunfire. He laughed softly, and for a moment, the war felt far away. He tried to settle into life again, helping on the family farm, fixing tractors with his father, eating in the same kitchen he'd left years ago. But nights were restless. He'd wake and walk outside, standing in the cold, staring up at the stars that had once been his battleground. "You can't just stop flying," he told Marjorie. "It's like asking your heart to stop beating." So when the Army Air Forces offered him a new position as a test pilot flying experimental jet aircraft, he accepted without hesitation. The new machine was called the Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star, the first American jet fighter. Faster than anything he'd ever flown, temperamental, dangerous. He loved it instantly. His superiors felt safe giving it to him. If anyone could master something untested, it was Bong. And maybe, deep down, they knew he needed the sky more than he needed safety. In his journal that March, he wrote, "The world is moving faster now. Jets, rockets, everything changing. The air feels different. Still, when I fly, I feel like that boy chasing the mail plane over Poplar again." He didn't know it yet, but history was closing around him again. The war that had made him would soon end and take him with it. The guardian angel had survived 40 duels with death. The 41st was waiting, patient, over California. By early 1945, the Pacific War was running out of islands and out of airmen. But one name still hung in the smoke above it all. Major Richard Ira Bong, the boy from Poplar who had outflown death 40 times. He came home not as a soldier, but as a symbol. The newspapers called him the guardian angel of the Pacific. The government called him a hero. But when the transport plane landed in California, Bong just wanted to breathe air that didn't taste like fuel or fire. He stepped off the ramp into a wall of cheers. Flashbulbs cracked like distant gunfire. Reporters shouted questions, their pens already writing him into legend. "How does it feel to be America's greatest ace?" one asked. Bong blinked against the light and said, "It feels like I'm finally home." But home was no longer the same. He had left a farm. He returned to a nation that saw him as myth. The next few months became a blur of parades, interviews, and ceremonies. His photo appeared in Life and Time. War bond rallies wanted his face. Aircraft factories wanted his handshake. Everywhere he went, banners followed, "Welcome home, Major Bong." He smiled politely, but the noise hollowed him out. The sky he'd ruled for years had shrunk into crowded banquet halls and patriotic speeches. People praised his calm. They didn't see the distance behind it. The war had stripped the shine off words like glory. He visited schools, stood beside generals, shook hands until his palm ached. But every night he sat alone in hotel rooms, watching streetlights flicker on walls, trying to hear something that wasn't applause. Then he went back to Superior, Wisconsin, where winter waited for him like an old friend. He found her there, Marjorie Vattendal, the librarian with the gentle eyes, who had written him through the worst of it. She met him at the train station, a small figure in a wool coat, snow melting in her hair. No cameras, no generals, no medals. Just two people who had waited too long. They walked home together through the snow. "You look tired," she said. He smiled. "I'm done fighting." They married on the 10th of February, 1945, in a modest ceremony at a Lutheran church. No band, no photographers, only family and a handful of friends. The war had made them both older than their years. The bride wore a plain white dress. The groom wore his Air Force uniform. Outside, snow fell softly white on white, like forgiveness. For a time, Bong tried to live like a man who wasn't built for flight. He helped his father repair tractors on the farm. He hunted in silence, split wood, fixed engines. The rhythm of the land was slower, older, filled with the sounds he'd grown up with: wind through fields, dogs barking in the distance, the clank of tools in the shed. It should have been peace, but peace has its own kind of noise. He woke often before dawn, heart pounding, the sound of propellers still echoing in his head. Marjorie would find him sitting on the porch, staring at the cold stars, hands trembling as if gripping an invisible control stick. He told her the nightmares didn't scare him anymore. They just reminded him of who he'd been. Then came the offer. The Army Air Forces wanted him back not as a fighter, but as a test pilot for a revolutionary new jet. The war was changing. Speed itself was evolving. Propellers were becoming relics. The new aircraft, the Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star, ran on pure jet thrust. It could climb faster than anything on Earth, breaking the horizon before the ground even noticed. Bong was hesitant. Marjorie was terrified. "You've done enough," she said. "Let someone else take the risks." He smiled, that same quiet smile she'd seen in every photograph. "It's not war," he told her. "It's the future." He moved to Burbank, California, to begin his new assignment. The P-80 was still experimental, a fragile promise of tomorrow. Test pilots were pioneers, and pioneers bled early. Engines overheated, fuel systems jammed. The smallest misstep meant fire. But Bong was steady, always steady. Colleagues said he handled the new jet as if it were an extension of his breath. "He's teaching the plane how to fly," one mechanic said. Meanwhile, the world was cracking open. Germany had surrendered in May, but the Pacific still burned Okinawa, Iwo Jima, a final storm of blood. Bong read the headlines each morning, folded the paper, and went back to the hangar. The war had taken enough from him. This was his way of giving back, testing the wings that would keep future pilots alive. He wrote to Marjorie often. The letters were gentler now, filled with domestic longing. "I want to build a house," he wrote, "plant trees, teach kids how to fly without killing anyone." In the summer of 1945, the airfield in Burbank was a hive of speed and noise. Engineers worked around the clock, pushing the P-80 toward combat readiness. Each test flight was a gamble. Bong had completed 22 hours in the cockpit, a fraction of what the manuals demanded. But he was Richard Bong, the man who'd tamed the lightning. Confidence was his currency. Then came the 6th of August, 1945, a date that would split history in half. That morning, the same sun rose over two very different worlds. Over the Pacific, a B-29 named Enola Gay carried the first atomic bomb toward Hiroshima. Over California, Richard Bong climbed into the cockpit of a P-80 Shooting Star for what was supposed to be a routine flight. Marjorie was in Wisconsin visiting family. They had spoken by phone the night before, making plans for the weekend. "Be safe," she said. He laughed. "Always." At 10:30 a.m., he taxied onto the runway. Ground crews watched as the jet screamed down the strip and lifted gracefully into the air. Everything looked perfect. The silver body shimmered against the morning haze. Then, 5 minutes later, the engine coughed once, twice, and died. Witnesses said the plane began to lose altitude fast. Bong tried to turn back toward the base, nose high, wings shaking. He triggered the ejection system, but it jammed. The jet hit an open field and exploded in a flash so bright it left men blinking. He was gone instantly. The news reached Wisconsin hours later. A telegram, a phone call. The same day America celebrated the bombing of Hiroshima victory headlines, on every paper, Marjorie Bong collapsed to the floor of her mother's kitchen. Her husband, the greatest ace in U.S. history, was dead. He was 24. Back in Poplar, Carl Bong walked to the barn and wept alone. Dora kept her son's room untouched for the rest of her life. The war had given them a hero. Peace had taken him back. The military called it a mechanical failure. A broken fuel pump in the new jet. The truth was crueler. The machine hadn't been ready, and no one could save him. But out of that tragedy came change. The investigation led to critical improvements in jet engine design and ejection systems, innovations that would save thousands of pilots in the years to come. In death, Bong taught the world how to fly safer. His funeral took place on the 11th of August, 1945. Thousands attended. Generals, pilots, mechanics, neighbors, schoolchildren. General Kenny, his old commander, delivered the eulogy. His voice cracked as he said, "He fought not for glory, but because it was his duty. He gave his life not in battle, but in service. He was the best of us." After the war, America tried to remember him properly. The Richard I Bong Air Force Base was built in Wisconsin. A bridge over Lake Superior carries his name. His beloved P-38 Marge was restored and placed in the Air Force Museum, her silver skin shining under museum lights, her nose art perfectly preserved. Visitors still stop there, reading the plaque beneath the propeller. Major Richard Ira Bong, U.S. Army Air Forces, 40 confirmed victories. Medal of Honor, died the 6th of August, 1945, a man who flew higher than fear. Marjorie never remarried. She spent the rest of her life tending his memory, organizing archives, working with historians, speaking quietly at memorial events. She died in 2003, buried beside him under a sky that once belonged to both of them. Time turned the war into history, but Bong's story never faded. It wasn't just about courage or skill, it was about balance, the impossible weight between duty and desire, between flight and fall. He lived fast, but never reckless, killed efficiently, but never cruelly, loved fiercely, but gently. In black and white photographs, his eyes remained steady, neither proud nor afraid, just aware. As if he already knew the cost of touching the sky. The farm boy who once chased a mail plane across the Wisconsin fields became America's greatest ace and then, in the cruel symmetry of fate, the first casualty of the jet age. The war ended that same week. The world exhaled. And somewhere above the noise of victory, a single echo remained, the sound of engines fading into silence. History doesn't stop when the engines fail. It echoes through the hangars, through the silence after applause, through the names carved into metal and memory. For Major Richard Ira Bong, the greatest American flying ace of World War II, the story didn't end with the crash. It only changed altitude. The morning of the 6th of August, 1945, burned itself into the world. Over the Pacific, a bomb called Little Boy fell toward Hiroshima. Over California, a jet called Shooting Star fell toward the Earth. Two explosions, one that ended a war, one that ended a man, and together they marked the beginning of a new age. When word of Bong's death reached Washington, the news drowned in celebration. America cheered the end of the bloodiest war in history. Only later, in the small town of Poplar, Wisconsin, did the silence catch up. The telegram arrived like a ghost. His father, Carl Bong, read it without a word, then walked out to the barn, where the air still smelled of oil and earth, and sat in the dark. His mother, Dora, refused to touch his room again. The bed stayed made, the desk untouched, a shrine to the boy who once fixed tractors and chased clouds. The nation mourned slowly, realizing what it had lost. Flags dropped to half-staff across military bases. President Harry Truman issued a statement calling Bong one of the most brilliant pilots who ever lived. But the words couldn't reach the farm roads of Wisconsin, where the snow fell soundlessly and the only sound was wind over frozen fields. The funeral came 5 days later. The 11th of August, 1945. The war had officially ended, but grief still marched in formation. Thousands attended. Generals in crisp uniforms, pilots with hollow eyes, farmers in wool coats, schoolchildren clutching paper flags. General George Kenny, his old commander, spoke through tears. He was brave without being reckless, famous without being arrogant. He fought not for glory but for duty, and now, when peace has finally come, we have lost one of the best men ever to take to the sky. No one clapped. The crowd stood still, the sound of the bugle folding the day into memory. The flag draped over his coffin shimmered like a piece of the same sky he had conquered. Marjorie stood by the casket, her hand pressed to the polished wood. She was 23, widowed before her first anniversary. When they lowered him into the ground, she whispered, "You can rest now, Dick. You're finally home." But history, restless as the wind, refused to let him fade. In the months that followed, engineers examined the wreckage of his Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star. They found the cause, a failed fuel pump, a malfunctioning ejection seat. His death led directly to new safety protocols and redesigns in the jet program. The next generation of aircraft would survive because Bong had not. It was a bitter kind of immortality, forged not in victory but in sacrifice. By 1948, as the U.S. Air Force became an independent branch, Bong's name had turned from a headline into a legend. The Richard I Bong Air Force Base was built in Wisconsin, a living monument to the man who had once mowed those same fields. Recruits trained under his name. In the mess halls, pilots spoke of doing a bong, hitting targets with precision and humility. His philosophy approach, strike, retreat, survive, became doctrine. He had revolutionized aerial combat by refusing to romanticize it. Others fought for glory. He fought for efficiency. Others chased heroism. He chased survival. And that, paradoxically, made him immortal. The 1,950 seconds came, loud with new wars and faster jets. Korea burned. Then Vietnam. Young pilots in silver F-86 Sabres and roaring F-4 Phantoms studied his tactics in flight manuals. Close, fire, get away. The 3 words he once scribbled in his notebook were still printed in bold on training charts. Every pilot who learned to value discipline over spectacle, strategy over ego, was carrying a piece of Richard Bong inside the cockpit. Yet, while the Air Force advanced into the supersonic age, back in Poplar the legend lived smaller, closer to the ground. His brother Harold took over the farm. The barn still smelled of gasoline and hay. Every September, on his birthday, townspeople gathered by the river to place flowers under a small granite marker engraved simply, Richard I Bong, 1,921,945. He flew higher than fear. Marjorie never remarried. She worked as a librarian, lived quietly in the same town where she and Richard had walked before the war. She became the caretaker of his story, donating letters, photographs, medals, even his flight gloves to museums. She spoke rarely, but when she did, her words cut clean through the decades. He didn't see himself as a hero, she said in a 1995 interview. He just wanted to do his job and come home. She passed away in 2003 at 79, buried beside him under the same Midwestern sky they both once looked up to. Today, his face still watches from photographs, black and white, the gaze steady and unblinking. You can see it in the Bong Veterans Historical Center in Superior, Wisconsin, the uniform pressed flat, the Medal of Honor gleaming, the small green notebook filled with careful handwriting. Beside it sits a letter that says everything about the man behind the myth. Every time I shoot down a plane, I think there's a man inside, someone with a family, with dreams. I do it because I have to, but I never celebrate. That was his secret. Not killer instinct, conscience. In an era when war made gods out of men, Bong stayed human. The modern world has forgotten the smell of burning aviation fuel, the scream of engines over jungle clouds. Wars now are fought by computers, satellites, and drones. The intimacy of combat, the raw closeness of one life taking another, is gone. And yet, when Air Force cadets study history, they still learn his name, not just for what he did, but how he did it. They learn that he refused to dehumanize his enemies. They learn that humility is not weakness. They learn that precision is mercy. Those lessons survive long after the roar of engines fades. Look closer, and Bong's story isn't just military, it's moral. He represents the paradox of America in the 1,940 seconds, a country torn between innocence and ambition, faith and firepower. He was the son of immigrants who believed in work, not glory. The farm boy who disassembled tractors to understand life, not to destroy it. And yet, when the call came, he transformed that same curiosity into mastery of flight and the art of war. He showed that the greatness of a nation is not measured by how loudly it celebrates victory, but by how quietly it carries its conscience. When you walk through the museum, the air feels still, heavy with the ghost of propellers. There's the photograph of him beside Marge, the P-38 Lightning, with the nose painted in delicate cursive. The plane gleams like a relic of another world, steel and sunlight, power and grace. Children point at it, veterans salute it. The docents speak softly, as though afraid to disturb the air around it. For a moment, you can almost hear the engines again, the twin hums of the Lightning rising, splitting the clouds, fading into the distance. Bong's record 40 confirmed victories remains unbroken. It probably always will. Modern warfare has no room for aces. Battles are fought by missiles beyond sight, far from courage's reach. But his legacy endures, not as a number, but as a compass. A reminder that greatness doesn't come from dominance, it comes from discipline. He taught generations of Americans that the point of power isn't to glorify destruction, but to prevent it. That true courage isn't loud, but quiet. That humanity, even in war, is the rarest form of victory. There's a moment each year, at dusk, when the Veterans Memorial in Poplar glows with candles. The wind moves across the fields the way it did when he was a boy, carrying the faint smell of frost and wood smoke. Somewhere far off, a jet crosses the sky, a silver shadow against the dying light. You can almost imagine Bong there, steady hands, calm breath, eyes fixed on the horizon. He would be over 100 years old now, but in the air, time stops meaning anything. The war that made him is long gone. The world he died for has changed. But what he stood for, discipline, humility, quiet excellence, remains the spine of the sky. Every time an American pilot lifts off into the clouds, there's a fragment of him in the sound. Every time a young cadet recites his name, the story takes flight again. In the end, Richard Ira Bong was not built for peace. He belonged to the thin air, where men find out what they're made of. He flew higher than any hero, not because he was fearless, but because he understood fear and faced it anyway. He was the farm boy who became a legend, the pilot who treated war like work, the man who died building the future he would never see. And in that silence, after the engines fade, somewhere between history and eternity, his voice still lingers, steady as ever, carried on the wind that crosses the old Wisconsin fields. Fly smart, come home, and never forget what it costs to stay alive. That is his last flight, and it never lands.